So I don't know how many days we've been working on this lecture, but we're going to get done with it today. We've read this several times, so we're fine. I'm just going to fly through what we've already talked about, and then we'll hunker down on the new stuff. It won't be very long. Jesus was in fleshly form. He was a true human being. He was 100% human, 100% God. I know that math doesn't work out, but it is true. He was unlike anyone else who's ever lived on earth. He was not a theophany. You were able to touch him. You were able to hear him. You were able to walk with him, and so he was not a theophany. And then we did this comparison from the tabernacle with Jesus, because when John talks about it in John that the word, I can't remember the exact word, but the word is tabernacle. That he tabernacled, and the word dwelt among us. That word dwelt means tabernacled. He tabernacled among us. And then there are a number of ways that Jesus was like the tabernacle. I changed that to outwardly ordinary. He looked like any other Jew. He didn't have, a glowing face or something like that. He got tired. He got thirsty, and he cried. He was like any other human being and looked like any other human being, except that he was God in the flesh. So that was definitely different. And then the tabernacle was the place where it was God's dwelling place on earth when it was with the Israelites. When Jesus came, he was God dwelling on the earth, just as the tabernacle was, and he is the place where helps us meet God. That he is the conduit to God. He is where God met people, and that was true also of the tabernacle. And it was in the center of Israel's camp, and what it says is that he is to be in the center of our lives as well. And then the purpose of his incarnation is to reveal the nature of God, to reveal who God is and what he is doing. I should mention this. Because it's probably on your quiz. So Jesus could do all the things that the Father could do because he was God. In other words, those unique things that only God can do, Jesus could do. And then let's talk a little bit about the phrase, the one and only Son. Another way of saying that would be unique and only Son. But he's even more than that. He is truly God. And then we see this saying of he was full of grace and truth. And that refers to his love and his justice. God, through his love, wants to offer us grace, which is something we don't deserve. but God didn't want to punish us. In his mercy, he didn't want to punish us. And the only way he could live with us forever was for sin to be atoned for. And so God and Jesus both voluntarily um, decided that Jesus would take that punishment so that we wouldn't have to. And remember that thing I wrote up there. Jesus really is the only way to bridge that gap between God and us. And then in verse 15, it says he came as a witness, as a witness. And that word is martyrio. In the Greek, the word is martyrio. Anybody see an English word in that? Mart. Martyr. Yeah. It's the root word of martyr. That to be a witness. And in Jesus' day and in the early church, to be a witness of Christ was likely to get you martyred. The only disciple that died a natural death was John, but he had been very mistreated in a number of ways. He was boiled in oil at one point, and he lived out the later part of his life in exile on the island of Patmos. But all the others were either crucified or buried alive or um, any other stoned, a number of ways. They all died for, you know what, we like to say they all died for what they believed, but I think they died for what they knew, because they knew Jesus had risen from the dead. So a martyr is one who's willing to die for that witness of Christ. Um, and um, and that's sobering, I know. And we live in a country that allows us freedom, but not everybody is living in a country like that. Not all Christians are living in a country like that. And the Bible tells us that at some point there will be martyrs again when the Antichrist comes. And I don't know when that will be. None of us does. But we need to be ready because we might not always have the freedom that we have now. So let's talk about the purpose of the incarnation. Um, so it was to reveal the nature of God, who God is. And in part of that is seeing Jesus. And Thomas said to Jesus at one point, just show us the Father, and that will be enough for me. And Jesus' answer was, Thomas, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That is an admission of deity on Christ's part, even though my professor said he never claimed to be God. And so until the birth of Christ, nobody had seen God. They'd seen theophanies, but they hadn't actually, they'd seen God's handiwork, but they hadn't actually seen God. But when Jesus was on earth, he was the place where God dwelt, and they were seeing God. And so in John, where it says, um, the only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. God has made Jesus known. And so when it says um, um, made known, it's talking about the Logos, right? The Word of God, and that He is God. So God made Jesus known to us, um, and and um, and God in the Bible, God called it the Logos, the Word of God. Jesus is the Word, and He is God. But what aspect of His nature did He come to reveal? And I believe He came to reveal a number of things, but two of them were grace and truth. We sometimes think of grace and truth as pitted against one another, but I don't think that's correct. I think they are both necessary, grace and truth. And in the Old Testament, the law is given, right? The law was given through Moses, John writes. And that's justice, right? And we want justice when it's someone else. We're not so sure we want it when we're in trouble, but it is what we deserve. So uh, yeah, where was it? Yeah. So we want God to be gracious on our sin, but sometimes we don't give that same grace to other people. But even in the Old Testament, God was showing His grace. Can you remember any examples in the Old Testament where God was gracious to His people? Manna in the wilderness. They didn't have anything to eat. Quail. They got sick of manna. They kept whining like, we don't have anything to eat. And then He gives them manna. Why manna? We're sick of manna. And so He gives them quail, and then the quail rots on their teeth. They're like, why did you do that? They were. The word in the Old Testament is gongasmos, and it sounds like grumbling, doesn't it? And that's what it means. They were grumbling, gongasmos. They gongasmos their way through the wilderness. But yeah, Jesus is the one who reveals the nature of God, and He's called the Logos, the expression of God. And we see this um, grace not just in the Old Testament, but in our own lives as well. God could have just wiped out His people and started over, but He didn't. He gave them grace. So, how does the incarnation of Jesus, of God, show grace? That was the purpose of His coming, wasn't it? Was to save people, and He didn't have to do that. He chose to do that. He chose to save people, um, and uh, God God didn't have to send Jesus, and Jesus didn't have to come, but and we were guilty. Make no bones about it. We were guilty. We were guilty, and we were deserving of of um, punishment. But Jesus came. He didn't come to a world that was like, Jesus, we love you. He came to a world that hated him, and He died anyway. And that's the grace of God, the grace of Jesus. Um, and we didn't deserve it. We don't deserve it. But He chose to die anyway. And that's how the incarnation reveals the grace of God. And I mentioned this a little bit ago, but these two words are used sometimes interchangeably, mercy and grace, but they're not exactly the same thing. Grace means giving us what we don't deserve. So God gives us salvation that we don't deserve. That's grace. Mercy is not giving us what we do deserve. We deserve judgment, but God doesn't give us judgment. So that's the difference between grace and mercy. They have some overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing. So God loved us so much, but His truthfulness could not let Him overlook our sin. Sin had to be punished for. Why? Yeah. And we understand that when it's somebody else, right? When somebody does something to you that is sinful, you get it. You get that sin. But sometimes we don't see that as much in ourselves. But we understand there's I'll do to reveal the truth of God. So God loved us, and he didn't want to be without us, so He sent Jesus. But here's the thing: sin had to be punished, but the grace and truth of God tells us at least three things: the awful consequences of sin. Sin never is neutral. Sin always divides and hurts and is uh, divisive, and sin is always has bad consequences. And then we also see God's hatred for sin, in part because what sin has done to the people that He loves, all of us. He loves everyone. And what sin has wrought on people that He loves. I can read a sad story in the paper, but if I don't know anyone, I feel bad, but whatever. But when it's someone I love that's getting hurt, that's a different ballgame. And God loves all of us, right? And it hurts His heart when we disobey, and when there are consequences, and there's real consequences if we're not going to trust Christ. And as I said earlier, we get that when it's someone else. We tend to minimize our sin. But if it's someone who sinned against us, that's bad. We get it when we have this idea of righteous anger. And there's some things that are so awful that it should make us angry, a righteous anger. We get it when it's child abuse or sex trafficking or whatever else it is, somebody getting burglarized or hurt in some way. But God couldn't overlook our sin, because sin cannot go unpunished. And so if He just said, "Oh, I love you so much, okay, I'll overlook your sin," then His justice is compromised, and He is just. He can't not be just. But if He punishes us, which is what we deserve, His love is frustrated. And He loves that. He loves us. So Jesus literally is the only way. God punished Himself so that we could be with Him. I want to go back to that idea that we get it when it's someone else. Every summer, not 2020, every summer for the last 19 summers, I go to a camp that is for children that are age 7 to 11, who have spent time in the foster care system. So every single one of those children have been either abused or neglected or both, and every one of them have been removed from their home. And next year will be my 20th year, and I didn't know what to expect that first year. By the way, when you turn 18, come to camp with me. You'll have to call me Storyteller Amy because that's my name at camp. I'm the Bible storyteller at camp. And it was two of my really good friends that were putting it on, so I said, okay, I'll go, and I didn't know what to expect. It changed my life in a powerful way. And camp is never far from my mind. And I've told them, you have me for life, or until I'm no longer any use to you, which might happen soon. But this first year, and I think it was like the first or second day, and this cabin of girls were coming. There are 4 girls and 2 counselors, and this little girl comes running up to me, and she's so excited, and she's telling me everything that she'd done already. And we had crafts, and we played on the playground, and we did, and she was just so, and I'm looking down in her little eyes, and she's looking up at me, and she's so excited. And I looked down in her eyes, and I realized somebody hurt this baby. She wouldn't be. And my heart broke in a way that it had never been broken. And it gets broken every single year. And in fact, every year I pray the same prayer. Lord, break my heart again. Break my heart again. Break my heart for what breaks yours. And the thing is that I became angry at the people who had hurt those children. And then something happened. There were twins early on in my years at camp, and twin boys, and they were a handful. We had to assign someone to either one of those boys because they were a handful. But I loved those boys. And I found out a number of years later, when they were teenagers, maybe 14, 15 years old, that they had raped 2 little girls. These are boys I love. But they did that. And they deserved, they went to prison. They went to prison. And they deserved that. But I still loved them. And that's when I realized that behind a sad story was another sad story. And it made it harder for me to be angry at those people. But make no mistakes about it. It's wrong. And it hurts people. And it ought not be. But because our world is sick, it is. So we understand that righteous anger. But if God punishes us, then his love is frustrated, as I just said. But like I said, if he just lets us go, that's not justice. And he is completely just. That's why Jesus is literally the only way for us to be saved. We'll stop there. And then I'm going to give you this quiz to take.